G'day, I'm Ben Lawson from Common Thread Consulting. This video outlines my suggestions for a fit-for-purpose risk management framework for New South Wales councils. And by that I mean basically that a framework that provides assurance that your council won't drop the ball. So OLG has issued these guidelines, and core requirement number 2 is the key one for this video. Each council and JO must implement a risk management framework consistent with the Australian standard. This must be in place by 1 July 24, and then GMs must attest in the 24-25 annual report that the framework is in place or note areas of non-compliance. If I was a GM, I'd think very carefully before I signed that off. A risk management framework provides assurance your council won't drop the ball, but it also provides evidence why your council did drop the ball if something goes wrong. And further, if I was a GM, I'd want assurance from the directors reporting to me, who should be seeking assurance from the managers reporting to them, that everything's on track or that they need to let me know where there's a problem. And I'd like to say to those people at tiers 2 and 3, particularly my fellow engineers with responsibility for things like water supply and roads, this is your opportunity. You're the ones who can see this problem. This is your opportunity to be heard and to communicate what's keeping you up at night and what we need to do about it. But the way OLG has written these guidelines is not going to help you or your GM or your councillors or your local community who have a reasonable expectation their local council won't drop the ball. It's important to distinguish the must-do bit, the core requirement to have a risk management framework in place by 1 July 24, from the guidance. And what I'm trying to do in this video isn't even just to offer alternative guidance, but to help you to understand the principles and key elements of the Australian standard, AS 31000. With all due respect, OLG's guidance fundamentally distorts what the standard says, and consequently, the design of the risk management framework based on that misunderstanding is such that it is not fit for purpose. Unfortunately, Marsh share the same distorted view as OLG, and they're providing the training and advice to most New South Wales councils. Very briefly and simply, with reference to the definition of risk in AS 31000, if you follow their guidance, OLG and Marsh, you're going to get a risk management system focused on the effect of uncertainty. Council's objectives don't really matter. In other words, it's not integrated with the frameworks that deal with council's objectives, namely your integrated planning and reporting framework. Marsh can perhaps be forgiven for this. They're brokers for statewide mutual. They're in the business of insuring you against such negative effects. And to be fair to them, councils are a long way from where they need to be in terms of setting meaningful objectives for their business. But I wouldn't let New South Wales government off so lightly. Someone in OLG has written these risk management guidelines purely from a risk management perspective. But New South Wales Government are also responsible for issuing the IPA&R guidelines, the regulatory and assurance framework for local water utilities, the Code of Accounting, and the guidelines on local strategic planning statements. If your council's risk management framework is going to be fit for purpose, you must integrate all your approach to these things. Because in the end, we're not just trying to avoid this, we're trying to achieve this. And the road we need to follow to get there is the integrated planning and reporting framework, since IPA&R is the legal framework for the system of local government in New South Wales. I think that's the best way to interpret Section 7 of the Act. IPA&R is about how your council does everything, even implement its risk management framework. Developing an integrated management systems framework can seem daunting, but that's only because the people in New South Wales government who write all this stuff use different terminology and see things from their own perspective. Practically, it's about grappling with the same issues. All of these things are dealing with the same issues. IPA&R is about asking and answering a few key questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how will we get there? These answers go in your delivery program, and your annual report is reporting back to the community on did we deliver what we said we would. The operational plan has further details on how we'll get there, the activities and budgets, but it's about the outputs to achieve the outcomes in the delivery program, if you like. I've got to say, OLG has said in the latest IPA&R guidelines that the delivery program and operational plan are supposed to be separate, but they haven't actually distinguished the two, apart from perhaps saying the OP has more detail. The way I'm describing them here, they're performing very different functions. So, where does risk management come into this? It prompts us to ask a further question. How can we be sure that we'll achieve our objectives? In other words, it provides assurance Council will meet its commitment to the community in the delivery program about what it'll deliver over its term in office, that it won't drop the ball, in other words. In view of this, I'd like to propose that we call it the IPA&R Framework. If you're going to develop your IPA&R Framework, you need to think about the key milestones ahead of you. I suggest that at present your council's probably just focused on their risk management framework, which needs to be in place from 1 July 24, and which the GM is then required to attest in the 24-25 annual report, which must be published by November 25. You're probably not even thinking about your next round of IPA&R yet, but there's an election in September 24, and then you'll need to complete your new IPA&R for adoption by 30th of June 2025. What I'm suggesting is that you've got more than 12 months to develop your IPA&R framework by 1 July 24, which will enable you to identify your council's key challenges and options to address these, and to start a meaningful conversation with the community about these ahead of the elections in September 2024. And that will lay the groundwork for the newly elected council to define its way forward in consultation with the community by June 2025. And then by November 2025, when the GM needs to make her attestation that council's risk management system is in place, she can do so with some assurance. Or, if there are areas of non-compliance, she can identify those in the annual report. If your council determines, based on engagement with your community about your challenges and options, you need a special rate variation, then that could happen in February 26, informed by all this groundwork that you're laying ahead of it. Which is really what leadership and commitment in AS 31000 is all about. I suggest this starts in the council chambers. This is the first point at which OLG is leading you astray. The guidelines identify roles and responsibilities, but they say the GM is responsible for approving council's risk management policy and for overseeing the risk management framework, while councillors are only responsible for approving the risk criteria or appetite statement in consultation with your audit committee. I'd argue it's the governing body's role to adopt the risk management policy, which I suggest could and should affirm your council's commitment to developing a risk management framework that's integrated with your IPA&R, in other words, your IPA&R framework, and the key elements of this. Your risk criteria is a key element within that framework, but both OLG and Marsh refer to this risk criteria as an appetite statement. The terms appetite and statement are not even used in AS 31000 in this context. OLG's description of the risk management process claims to be reflecting what's in AS 31000. OLG says the risk criteria appetite statement documents are supposed to identify the amount and type of risk that the governing body is willing to take or not to take in order to achieve its strategic plan and objectives. Back to this figure, it's like starting with your strategic plan and objectives, where we are, where we want to be, and then considering what your risks are that you'll tolerate in order to achieve those objectives. Council then defines its risk appetite, whether it wants to avoid a particular risk or whether it is resistant to it or willing to accept it or even receptive to it. But this appetite is being defined in relation to these generic risk categories like people, finance and environment, rather than a specific objective of council. This risk appetite statement applies regardless of the objective. In other words, council's objectives pale into insignificance. When we look at what AS 31000 actually says, we can see how fundamentally the description in OLG's guidelines actually is. The standard says that risk criteria are about the amount and type of risk that the organisation is willing to take or not to take relative to its objectives. There's no suggestion here that we can lose sight of council's objectives. The risk we're interested in is the effect of uncertainty on these specific objectives, which can be positive or opportunities or negative threats. If that wasn't clear enough, the standard goes on to reinforce my interpretation here by adding that the risk criteria should be customised to the specific purpose and scope of the activity and the scope under consideration. In other words, it's different for transport than it is to water supply. It's not an argument over terminology here. This has very practical implications for the rest of the risk management process, for risk assessments, as well as the development and implementation of risk treatment plans off the back of these. So now I've cleared up the theory, we can finally get into some of these practical examples. I've selected these two, not just because they're up there amongst the biggest risks your council is facing, but also because the differences between these two highlight how important it is to focus on your council's specific objectives rather than generic risks. If you're watching this video and thinking this is all too technical engineering stuff, you need to think again. Unless your council's decision makers get their heads around this stuff, they will never understand the organisation they're responsible for leading. So let's start with sealed roads. Say council's objective for its transport function is something like a quality, safe, efficient and sustainable transport network. Each of these terms means something. It is a sub-objective, if you like. It needs its own performance measures. For example, one of the measures for the quality aspect might be the length of sealed road pavement in unsatisfactory condition. It's not about community satisfaction. It needs to be something more meaningful than that. That's just an indicator. That performance measures, that's a whole other video. But you can describe the length clearly. Council can quantify the baseline for this measure, where it's starting from, and then a target that they're aiming for at the end of their term in office. If you ask most councillors, council executives and community members, how will we get there? I expect they'll say, fix the failed sections of road, or more likely, fix my failed road. It seems obvious, but it's also largely incorrect. Before you can define our path to achieving this objective, we need to assess the risks, the effect of uncertainty on this particular objective. This will include opportunities. Maybe there's some things that we can do that will mean that we're going to drop down our length of unsatisfactory roads to 8 kilometres. And threats, maybe there's some things that could lead us to end up with 32 kilometres of unsatisfactory roads. So what are the main sources of uncertainty? Number one should be pretty obvious. Weather. Every council in New South Wales is no doubt acutely aware that right now prolonged wet weather results in accelerated failure of road pavements. But if you think back to 2019 and 2020 when we're in drought, your roads were probably holding up okay for the most part. Number two is also pretty obvious. If we get more money, then we can invest more in our roads and have less that are unsatisfactory. Number three is not at all obvious and warrants a quick lesson in road building. There's 3 rules to road building: drainage, drainage and drainage. If you build a road that looks like this, then it rains, the water stays on the road and starts washing away the surface, and it soaks into the road pavement weakening it, and before long your road looks like this. Time and again when I've run through this video with councillors and members of roads advisory committees, they tell me that's what our roads look like. Which is why we need our roads to look like this. We need a good road formation. So when it rains, the water is shed off the road and into the table drains on each side and then away. Table drains are the second rule, by the way. Then next, unless you're a farmer out the back of Coonamble or Mulwaree, then you probably have the luxury of some gravel on your road. And if you're really lucky, council might add a bitumen seal over that gravel to protect it and to provide a waterproof layer to keep the water out. But the third and final rule of road building is that the bitumen oxidises and cracks over time and begins to let water in, which is why your council's reseal program is the most critical investment it can make on its sealed roads. It's a textbook example of a stitch in time saves 9. If you invest $33,000 a kilometre in a reseal, then you can avoid premature failure of the underlying gravel pavement, which might cost, say, $270,000 per kilometre. So there you have it, the 3 rules of road building. So thinking back to this largely incorrect response to the question of how council should best proceed if it's to provide a quality road network with the limited funds it has available, I can now explain why councils shouldn't focus their very limited funds on the roads that have already failed. Rather, they must triage their roads to prioritise their funding available. What I mean is this. Let's say council has a road network where there's 157 kilometres of roads that need a reseal and 21 kilometres that have failed and need full reconstruction. In triage terms, these can be saved, these are already dead. I've got to throw this great example of transparency and accountability out there at this point. Federation Council, in their State of Our Council Infrastructure Assets report, have actually identified the roads falling into each of these triage categories. So let's say Council has $3 million to invest in its sealed local road network. If it puts all of this into the failed pavements, it can afford to fix 11 kilometres at $270,000 a kilometre. And that'll keep the community happy in the short term because they can see council addressing the quality issues on the network. They're fixing the failed pavements. So that means that there's only 10 kilometres of unsatisfactory road pavements. But the trouble is that while they're doing that, 16 kilometres, as an example, has now failed of the roads that only needed a reseal. So the length of roads needing a reseal goes down to 141 kilometres, but the total now needing reconstruction goes up to 26 kilometres. So council has actually gone backwards. Let's say instead that council spends even $1 million on their reseals. So at $33,000 a kilometre, that'll do 30 kilometres towards that sustainability objective. And then it spends the other $2 million on 7 Ks of road reconstructions to improve the quality. That's taken a risk. You're still going to lose a few of those, either just before you reseal them or because you haven't been able to triage all the roads properly. But that's what the whole risk management process is about. And so the wash up of all this is that there's 124 Ks now needing a reseal, and there's 17 kilometres that needs reconstruction. So in other words, you're not digging yourselves a hole. This is, of course, a massive oversimplification, but the basic story we're trying to tell is this. If we adopt a fix my failed road strategy, then we're going to go downhill. But if we adopt a triage our roads to prioritise our investment, our limited funds, we're going to get there slowly if we stick to it over the long term. So I hope it's now clear that if council wants to achieve its objective of providing a quality road network, then it needs to be sustainable too. While quality is measured in terms of unsatisfactory road pavements, the bumpy roads experienced by the community, sustainability should be measured in terms of the length of reseals that are overdue and the length of table drains that need clearing. So where does the risk management framework come into this? Remember, it's about asking how can we be sure we'll achieve our objective of providing a quality, safe, efficient and sustainable transport network. To answer that, we need to assess the risks, and to do that we need reliable condition data, and we need to understand and be able to quantify the likelihood of failure. And that's the certain pavement in a certain condition, with a seal in a certain condition, certain level of rubbish in the table drains, all of that, and the weather, that all influences the likelihood of failure. And only then, though, can we put a number on our baseline and start to think about what risk treatment we can implement to achieve those objectives. It's important to note how this IPA&R framework integrates with the Code of Accounting Practice and financial reporting at this point too. This will enable auditable reporting on the infrastructure asset performance measures in your financial statements. You'll simply be reporting on Council's baseline performance against its objectives. I suggest the renewal backlog is simply the reseals that you need to do. The maintenance shortfall is things like the need for clearing of table drains. Those are both high risk only measures in my view. Doesn't mean you can't report on the unsatisfactory roads, but I'd suggest that's an agreed level of service issue. And I'd also suggest that unless you've asked the community whether they're willing to pay for better levels of service, then it simply reflects the service levels that you can afford. Now, I understand under the approach I'm outlining here and the timelines I went through earlier, these measures will be auditable from your 24-25 statements onwards. That's 10 years after OLG told us in Circular 1529, look it up on their website, that audits of what was then called Special Schedule 7 would commence from the 2015-16 statements. But auditors have pushed back at the time because there was no meaningful standard to audit against, and it's gone nowhere. What I'm saying is that this approach enables auditing against Council's risk management framework. And in fact, councils will be auditing against this framework anyway, because their internal audit program will need to cover this stuff. Basically, the whole framework of performance reporting needs a review. The OLG's renewal ratio needs throwing out, but if you're reporting in your financial statements against these performance measures on your infrastructure, then surely wouldn't it be better to have something that was more accurate and that gave you some assurance in the numbers, right? Anyway, back onto the risk management process. So we've got reliable condition data to establish our baseline, and we've got our heads around the likelihood of failure, which then enables us to model our network performance over time, given a certain level of investment on certain activities. And I'm talking simple spreadsheets here, by the way, not fancy pavement management systems. We can now move on to the next stage of the risk management process, risk treatment. The treatment methods to manage the sustainability risks are obvious. Reseals and table drain clearing. But hang on, that's the same activities you're going to put in your operational plan. That means your operational plan is your risk treatment plan. It's also year one of your asset management plans and your long-term financial plan, by the way. And the service levels that OLG requires you to put in your asset management plans, that's the objectives in your delivery program. Anyway, once you've got at least a basic appreciation for all these moving parts, you can put this to council and ideally engage the community about all of these things in order to select a way forward that you see as representing the best possible value for your local community, which means that you can set a target in relation to your particular performance objective. At this point, it's important to come back to this figure, and I need to point out that triaging your available funds isn't a magic wand. What you might find is that even though you optimise your available funds, they're just not enough to halt the decline. At best, you're going to slow it down, which is, of course, where you need to be talking to your community about a special rate variation, potentially coupled with some hard decisions elsewhere, so you've got more money to invest. The last point before I move on, back to the risk treatment plan being equivalent to your operational plan, is that OLG are telling you that there should be a quarterly risk report going to the general manager. But the GM's also required to produce a 6-monthly progress report on the delivery program to council. I suggest that if you are talking about progress, then you're actually talking about the outputs in the operational plan, which is how you work towards the outcomes in the delivery program. But anyway, why not combine these? If I was a councillor or an audit committee member, and actually I am on 4 audit committees, I'd want to see those quarterly risk reports. And I hope it's starting to be clear that while there's a lot to think about in setting all of this up, if you get the integration right, it will be far simpler in the future and make for better, simpler planning and reporting. Anyway, I need to move on. I've covered most of the issues I wanted to with roads, but there's a couple of things to draw out via this second example of a safe and secure water supply, which is another of council's biggest risks. The safety of the water supply is generally measured in relation to compliance with the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. The baseline, your current performance, might be less than 100%, but the target should always be 100%. That's the legislative requirement under the New South Wales Public Health Act. While council still needs to understand the uncertainties and so the opportunities and threats, council wants complete assurance that it will achieve that 100% objective all of the time. The water supply will always comply. So the answer to the question, how can we be sure, the focus of the risk management system, is we're going to develop and implement a drinking water quality management system in compliance with the New South Wales Health Guidelines. The answer to the question how we will get there, the focus of the operational plan in IPA&R, is that we'll implement the Drinking Water Quality Management Plan, which governs the treatment plant operations, the water quality testing and reporting, and identifies work to be done, like installing a new chlorine monitor. So do we just wait around though and until council publishes its annual report to find out if we've met our objective? Of course not. Here we can see that there's an importance of distinguishing between performance reporting on the outcomes in the delivery program, did we achieve those objectives, and performance monitoring, which is against the operational plan, I suggest, in the delivery program progress report and in your risk reports. So that's about, will we achieve those objectives? And another way of saying this is to differentiate lead and lag indicators. It's worth throwing in here that a drinking water quality management system includes a means of monitoring the risk of failure via the concept of critical control points. The idea of a multi-barrier system in drinking water quality is that you can have a failure along the way in the process, but it gets picked up at the next critical control point before council actually supplies non-compliant water. But you obviously want to know if all these barriers are working so that you're going to have maximum assurance. And if you're getting exceedances at one or more of the critical control points, that's telling you you're more likely to have a failure at the tap. Last but not least, water security. I want to look at this because it provides an opportunity to explain how the Department of Planning and Environment's regulatory and assurance framework for local water utilities integrates perfectly with this IPA&R framework I'm outlining. The first guiding principle of the DPE framework is outcomes focused. Council's objectives in its delivery program are equivalent to the strategic planning outcomes. For example, a safe and secure water supply is equivalent to understanding water quality, and a secure water supply is understanding water security. Some of the other outcomes relate to corporate functions like finance and governance, but it's quite easy to align them all. So that's the outcome, but the actual measure for a council's water security objective, for example, would be along the lines of the severity, duration and regularity of restrictions required to avoid running out of water. Next, there's DPE's second guiding principle, risk-based prioritisation. Let's say council doesn't have any up-to-date information incorporating the latest climate change modelling on its water security. Its level of uncertainty will be significant, but there will also be opportunities to improve water security, things like water loss reduction programs, effluent reuse, demand management via pricing, etc. And there will be threats, not least a major drought, but also growing demand from residential and/or industrial consumers. The ground level action to be taken to achieve water security, if you like, is for council to prepare a water conservation and drought management plan that takes action as best council can in response to these opportunities and threats, and in particular establishes trigger points for the imposition of restrictions, say dam levels. But that's not going to be enough on its own. So how can council gain greater assurance about the security of its supply? Undertake a water security study, which is usually done as part of an integrated water cycle management strategy, and that's exactly what DPE wants you to do too. They want to know what council's understanding of its water security is to a reasonable standard, as in sufficient, appropriate and robust. That will then inform the risk treatment plan. In addition to updating the water conservation and drought management plan, let's say the study finds that the secure yield of council's supply isn't enough to get it through the worst drought, and it might come up with a solution like constructing new bores and a pipeline. It's really important to recognise that OLG's mandatory infrastructure asset performance measures, the ones you report on in your financial statements, specifically exclude new and upgraded assets. Many of the biggest risks in water supply and sewerage relate to new assets though, and this is another good reason to get rid of those measures altogether and take a different risk-based approach. All of that will have to wait for another video, but DPE says they'll prioritise according to risk, but that risk assessment needs to inform council's risk register now, not in 2 or 3 years' time when the IWCM strategy is finally finished. It's great to see that DPE has flagged their intention to move towards an integrated approach between their framework and IP&R, for example in the guidance document I contributed to, but I hope it's clear why they really need to be providing guidance for councils now and how it can and should integrate with their risk management framework. It can't wait until the next cycle of IP&R. If it's going to integrate, it needs to integrate with the risk management frameworks that councils are developing now. G'day. So I hope those practical examples have given you an appreciation of what's required to manage a couple of the biggest risks facing your council properly and practically. And I hope it's given you an appreciation for the fact that a risk appetite statement like this is not going to help you make meaningful, informed decisions. I acknowledge what I'm saying is complex, but council's business is complex. As Einstein said, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. I'd argue whoever in OLG has written these risk management guidelines has oversimplified it. They've made their job simpler in specifying that, but ignoring the need to integrate that with everything else council does. Same as DPE with their regulatory and assurance framework. They've made their job simple, but if it's going to be meaningful for the end users, for my fellow engineers and for councillors who've got to make decisions off the back of this and justify those decisions to those people who are bailing them up in the pub, then there's got to be an integrated approach and it's got to be simple. The risk management guidelines fall well short in this regard, but they get this much right. Leadership and commitment are critical. That can come from the council chambers, but I think this needs to be championed by GMs. And the good news is that your GMs have got more skin in the game than everyone else on this. And so those of you who just have self-interest should be sitting up and taking notice. But I know most of you have higher aspirations than this. And I've got to say, though, it's not going to be any yellow brick road. It's going to be a hard slog. So it's worth paraphrasing Steve Jobs at this point. It's going to take a lot of hard work to implement this integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework that's simpler for the end user. But it will be worth it because it will help you and your council to truly understand your underlying challenges and to come up with elegant solutions. Wouldn't that be great? So, summing this up, OLG have got it wrong. AS 31000 says nothing about appetite statements. Risk criteria are about the risk council is willing to take relative to its objectives, not in order to achieve those objectives. The risk criteria must be customised to the specific purpose and scope of the activity you're dealing with. An integrated planning and assurance framework is complex, but if you think it's simpler, you probably don't understand your business. I see little evidence in the guidelines issued by New South Wales Government that they really understand council's business as a whole. All their guidelines related to this stuff need rewriting. And Ron Honig, I'd love to talk to you about this. The last government left a terrible legacy, not least in my hometowns of Chimit and Tumbarumba. And you've got a great opportunity to leave a great legacy. A really positive one that truly strengthens local councils and helps them deliver good value to their local communities. But to the people that are in councils, I suggest you probably can't wait for Ron. This 1 July 2024 deadline is going to come around really fast, as is your next round of IPA&R. You need to start now. I'd encourage you to work with other councils on this. A standard template on all this is very achievable. You can collaborate on solutions. You can then benchmark on your performance because you'll have those consistent objectives. The sky's the limit. And of course, I'd love to help. Here's my contact details. I'm putting all these ideas out there in the hope I can change people's thinking. But you need support to do it and do it well. This video has just been dipping your toe in the water. I've prepared a set of guidelines and templates to describe the key elements of this integrated planning, assurance and reporting framework. If there's enough interest, I'd be keen to run a set of workshops where councils can work collaboratively through all of this with their peers and with me. And if you're interested but not convinced, I'd love to hear from you. Happy to talk it through in person. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching.